software, cultural operating systems, and biological hardware ultimately translate into a real-world example. To show you, I've prepared something of a civilizational case study. What I've done is collect a whole bunch of graphs which track certain social variables over time in the United States. And what I want to do is overlay them with each other so that their timescales line up and we can see if there is any discernible patterns which emerge from the combined data. I think the best place to start would be divorce. Apart from the fact that it's a trend most people are already familiar with, I think it's a good place to start to set some of the basic parameters of our graph. Most of the social data collected seems to reliably start around the end of World War II. With divorce, we see a little bit of a rise at the end of the war, which I would say is probably the result of unworkable marriages that were hastily entered into by troops before being deployed, followed by a levelling off through the 50s, and then a truly massive rise through the 60s and 70s. Next, we'll add crime rates. Violent crimes, property crimes, and total crimes. Now, obviously, these are happening at different scales. Violent crimes are relatively rare, only a few dozen per 10,000 people. And total crime is necessarily going to be higher, being a combination of the other two. This doesn't really matter though. We don't really care about the vertical scale. What we care about is whether there is a broad correlation between the relative rates of these social variables along the same time scale. So what I'm going to do is normalize these graphs by vertically scaling them against each other. As you can see, there is an almost perfect correlation between divorce and all three crime metrics. Single motherhood is a little bit different. It starts off level with the others, begins to rise at the same rate as the others, but then it just keeps going up and up. Interestingly, no correlation with single fatherhood. Suicide, on the other hand, once again, an almost perfect fit. Without necessarily knowing the exact nature behind how all of these social variables are linked together, I think it's more than fair to say that there was a very broad and noticeable and consistent shift in the national culture of America at this particular time in the country's history. Now, this next graph is probably going to ruffle a few feathers, but it really does need to be addressed as part of this discussion, and that is government largesse. Based on this graph, there is no doubt that government expenditure as a percentage of the nation's GDP has steadily been growing over time. However, the social problems that we're examining here don't seem to be caused by or even vaguely correlate to this growing government largesse. Don't get me wrong, I'd love a smaller, more streamlined government. I'd love to cut a whole bunch of useless welfare and social programs so I could pay less tax. I'd especially love for rich politicians to be held accountable when they receive hundreds of thousands of tax dollars in travel expenses to essentially stay in their own fucking houses. In that sense, the libertarian goal of small government is a perfectly noble goal. But for all of this conspiratorial whispering about cultural Marxism, if we are going to be frankly honest about this situation we're in, government largesse is not the direct cause, and shrinking the government, if that's even possible, is not going to make these social problems go away. I know that's not what a lot of people want to be hearing, but, there's the data. So that really brings us to the ultimate question.